May 15, 1944. RAF Tempsford Airfield, England. AC-47 transport plane climbed into the darkness over the English Channel. Its bomb bay doors open. But this aircraft carried no bombs instead. Crew members stood at the opening, shoving bundles of aluminum foil strips out into the night sky, watching them tumble and scatter in the aircraft's wake like metallic confetti. Below, on German radar screens, 90 miles away, operators watched in growing alarm as a massive fleet of ships appeared to be crossing the channel, heading straight for Calais. Except there were no ships, just aluminum foil. And in 3 weeks, this same trick would help 156,000. Allied soldiers land on the beaches of Normandy, while Hitler's best divisions sat waiting for an invasion that would never come. The story of how American manufacturing and British ingenuity created the greatest deception in military history begins not with generals or battleships, but with a 28-year-old physicist named Joan Curran, staring at a problem that seemed impossible to solve. It was April 1942. The German Luftwaffe was devastating British cities. Night after night, German bombers found their targets with uncanny precision, guided by sophisticated radar systems that could track aircraft from 100 miles away. British pilots were dying trying to jam these radars with bulky electronic equipment that barely worked and weighed hundreds of pounds. Joan Curran worked at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, one of the few women in a facility dedicated to radar countermeasures. While her male colleagues focused on complex electronic jamming systems, Curran asked a simpler question. What if we didn't need to jam the radar signal? What if we could just confuse it? She understood that radar worked by bouncing radio waves off objects and measuring the return signal. Metal reflected radio waves beautifully. A large bomber returned a strong signal. But what if you could make the radar see thousands of bombers where none existed? Curran's insight was almost childishly simple. Cut aluminum foil into strips, exactly half the wavelength of German radar frequencies, about 27 centimeters long, and these strips would resonate with the radar waves, reflecting signals just like real aircraft. Drop enough of these strips from a plane, and enemy radar screens would light up with false contacts, making it impossible to distinguish real bombers from phantom ones. She called it window. The Americans would later call it chaff, and it would become one of the most effective weapons in the Allied arsenal, despite being nothing more than cut-up aluminum foil. But there was a problem. When Curran first proposed the idea in June 1942, British military leadership refused to deploy it. Their logic was grimly simple. If we use this trick, the Germans will immediately copy it and use it against us. Our radar defenses, which had saved Britain during the Battle of Britain, would become useless overnight. For over a year, window sat unused while the debate raged. British bombers continued dying in droves over Germany by mid-1943. Bomber Command was losing 5 to 7% of aircraft on every mission over heavily defended targets. At those rates, bomber crew survival was essentially a coin flip over 30 missions. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, Winston Churchill's scientific advisor, Professor Frederick Lindemann. In June 1943, Lindemann argued that Britain was no longer the one playing defense. The Luftwaffe was weakened. The invasion of Europe was being planned, and the ability to blind German radar would be far more valuable to the Allies than to Germany. The risk had flipped. On July 23, Churchill personally authorized the use of window. That same night, 746 British bombers took off for Hamburg, carrying bundles of aluminum strips alongside their bombs. What happened next shocked even Curran. German radar operators watched their screens fill with thousands of contacts. Their entire air defense system, one of the most sophisticated in the world, became essentially useless. Night fighters couldn't find targets. Anti-aircraft guns fired blindly. The bombers struck Hamburg with devastating accuracy. Over 4 nights, Hamburg was essentially destroyed. Of 746 bombers in the first raid, only 12 were lost, a loss rate of 1.6%. Compared to the usual 5 to 7%, Window had reduced bomber losses by more than 2/3. The Americans, watching these results with intense interest, immediately saw larger possibilities. If aluminum foil could blind radar, it could do more than just protect bombers. It could create entire phantom armies. This is where American industrial capacity entered the story. In August 1943, U.S. military planners began working on Operation Fortitude, the deception plan for D-Day. The goal was to convince Hitler that the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais, 150 miles northeast of the actual landing beaches in Normandy. Creating this illusion would require phantom armies, fake radio traffic, dummy equipment, and false intelligence. But most critically, it would require convincing German radar that a massive invasion fleet was heading for Calais while the real fleet approached Normandy. The Americans needed chaff, billions of strips of it, and they needed it produced in quantities that would have been impossible for any other nation on Earth. In September 1943, contracts went out to American aluminum manufacturers. The specifications were precise. Aluminum foil strips 27 centimeters long, 2 centimeters wide, packed in bundles of 2,000 strips each. Each bundle weighed approximately half a pound. The strips had to be cut precisely because even a few centimeters difference would change their radar signature. What American manufacturers accomplished over the next 8 months demonstrated industrial capacity that bordered on the absurd. By May 1944, American factories had produced approximately 20 million bundles of chaff, roughly 40 billion individual strips of aluminum foil. If you laid them end to end, they would circle the Earth 270 times. The scale of this production is difficult to comprehend. Factories were cutting, bundling, and packaging nearly 170 million strips of aluminum foil every day for 8 months straight. This was happening while those same factories were simultaneously producing aluminum for aircraft, engines, and thousands of other war materials. The ability to add this to the production schedule without disrupting anything else showcased manufacturing flexibility that no other nation could match. But producing the chaff was only half the challenge. Using it effectively required precise coordination, perfect timing, and crews willing to fly repeated missions into dangerous airspace, doing nothing but dropping aluminum foil. This is where the 218th Squadron of the Royal Air Force and the 803rd Bombardment Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Forces entered the story. These units specialized in what they called special electronic operations, a polite term for flying slow. Vulnerable aircraft in circles over the channel, while German shore batteries shot at them, and German night fighters hunted them. The crews practiced for months. The technique required precise choreography. Aircraft would fly in tight circles, dropping bundles of chaff at exact intervals timed to their speed and altitude. The chaff would drift down slowly, carried by wind, creating a radar signature that mimicked a fleet of ships moving at 7 to 8 knots toward the coast. On German radar screens, it would look like a convoy of hundreds of vessels. In reality, it would be 18 aircraft dropping aluminum foil. The final test came on the night of June 5 to 6th, 1944, D-Day. Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer would create 2 phantom invasion fleets, one appearing to approach Calais, one approaching Boulogne. Meanwhile, the real invasion fleet of 6,000 vessels would approach Normandy. At 11 p.m. on June 5th, 18 aircraft from 218 Squadron RAF took off from England. They carried no bombs, no ammunition, nothing but bundles of chaff and enough fuel for a 6-hour mission. They formed up over the channel and began their intricate dance, flying precise racecourse patterns while dropping bundles of aluminum foil at 30-second intervals. As the chaff drifted down through the darkness, German radar operators 20 miles away watched their screens light up with contacts. First dozens, then hundreds. The signatures looked exactly like ships, large, slow-moving vessels, advancing in formation toward the Pas-de-Calais. German military intelligence had predicted for months that Calais would be the invasion point. It was the shortest crossing from England. It offered the most direct route to Germany. And now their radar screens showed exactly what they had expected. A massive fleet approaching Calais. Admiral Theodor Crank, commanding German naval forces in the west, received the radar reports at 1:30 a.m. His staff calculated that a fleet of 200 to 300 vessels was approaching Calais. He immediately ordered defensive positions, strengthened and requested that Panzer divisions held in reserve near Paris be moved toward Calais. Meanwhile, 150 miles southwest, 156,000 Allied soldiers were landing on 5 beaches in Normandy. German radar had detected the real fleet, but with limited radar coverage and the expectation that Calais was the target, these contacts were initially dismissed as possibly being the diversionary attack. The crucial hours between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. on June 6 determined everything. The Phantom Fleet kept German attention and reserves focused on Calais. By the time German High Command realized the Normandy landings were the main assault, Allied forces had established beachheads. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest defensive force with 18 divisions, remained near Calais waiting for an invasion that would never come. Hitler himself, convinced that Normandy was a diversion, refused to release panzer reserves for a counterattack until afternoon on June 6. By then, it was too late. The Allies had landed 156,000 troops and were consolidated enough that even armored counterattacks couldn't dislodge them. Those crucial hours were purchased with aluminum foil, precise flying, and the industrial capacity to produce billions of strips of metal cut to exact specifications. The mathematics of the deception were almost absurd in their simplicity. 20 million bundles of chaff, costing approximately $1.50 per thousand bundles, totaling around $30,000 in materials, created a deception that fooled the most powerful military in Europe, and may have saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. The tactical success of Chaff in protecting bombers was obvious and immediate. But the strategic success of using it for deception only became clear years later when historians gained access to German military records. They showed that German High Command remained convinced for weeks after D-Day that the Normandy landings were a diversion, and that the main invasion would still hit Calais. The 15th Army, which could have devastated the Normandy beachhead if committed on June 6th or 7th, remained in place near Calais until mid-July. This extended deception had consequences far beyond the initial landing. It gave Allied forces time to build up supplies, reinforce positions, and establish the logistics network needed to break out of Normandy. When the breakout finally came in late July with Operation Cobra, Allied forces had such overwhelming superiority that German forces in France essentially collapsed. Military historians have debated for decades what would have happened if the 15th Army had counterattacked on June 6th. The consensus is sobering. The invasion might have failed. At minimum, casualties would have been catastrophic. The Allied foothold in Normandy on June 6 was precarious enough that adding 18 divisions of fresh German troops to the battle could have been decisive. Instead, those divisions sat near Calais, waiting for phantom ships that were actually bundles of aluminum foil dropped from slow-flying aircraft by crews who probably never fully grasped the strategic importance of their unglamorous missions. The genius of the operation lay in its simplicity. No complex technology, no sophisticated electronics, just precisely cut aluminum. Foil dropped in precise patterns to create an illusion that exploited enemy expectations and limitations. It was deception reduced to its purest form. Give the enemy exactly what they expect to see, and they won't question whether it's real. American industrial capacity made it possible. British scientific ingenuity designed it, Allied aircrews executed it. And Hitler's fixed belief that Calais must be the invasion target made him interpret the evidence exactly as the Allies intended. The production numbers tell the story of American manufacturing at its peak. Between September 1943 and May 1944, American factories produced enough chaff to create false radar signatures, equivalent to approximately 50,000 ships. The actual cost was negligible, around $30,000 in materials plus labor. For cutting and bundling, compare that to the cost of building even one real Liberty ship at $2 million. And the efficiency of the deception becomes clear. After D-Day, chaff became standard equipment for every Allied bomber and reconnaissance aircraft. By war's end, American and British factories had produced over 50 million bundles, more than 100 billion individual strips of aluminum. Foiled at this material confused German radar so effectively that by late 1944, German air defenses were essentially operating blind, forced to rely on visual spotting and guesswork. The technological race that followed illustrated the endless cycle of countermeasure and countermeasure that characterized electronic warfare Germany. Developed radar systems that attempted to filter out Chaff signatures. The Allies responded, with Chaff cut to different lengths to confuse the new radars. Germany tried frequency-hopping radar. The Allies produced Chaff in multiple lengths mixed together. Each innovation was countered. Each counter was countered again. But Germany never regained the radar superiority they had enjoyed in 1942. The introduction of window Chaff in July 1943 marked a permanent shift in the electronic warfare balance. Allied bombers flew with progressively lower loss rates as German air defenses struggled to adapt. By early 1945, bomber loss rates had fallen below 1%, even on heavily defended targets. The human stories behind the production are easily forgotten. Tens of thousands of American factory workers, many of them women who had taken manufacturing jobs as men went to war, spent months cutting aluminum foil to precise specifications. The work was tedious, repetitive, and seemingly insignificant. Workers had no idea that the aluminum strips they were cutting would create phantom fleets that would deceive Hitler. This disconnect between the simplicity of the task and the enormity of its impact characterized much of the American war. Effort, individual contributions seemed trivial. Cutting aluminum foil, welding ship hulls, riveting aircraft panels, but aggregated across millions of workers and industrial facilities, spanning a continent. These trivial contributions became the material foundation of Allied victory. Joan Curran, the physicist, whose insights started it all, received no public recognition during the war. Her work remained classified until the 1970s. She continued her career in radar research, contributing to numerous advances in telecommunications and electronic warfare. When asked in a 1985 interview about window Chaff, she expressed surprise at its significance. It seemed obvious once you thought about it. I assumed someone else would have thought of it if I hadn't. This modesty understated the insight required. Thousands of scientists and engineers had worked on radar countermeasures. Only Curran realized that the simplest solution, passive reflectors requiring no power, number complex electronics, just precisely cut metal, would be the most effective. The legacy of Chaff extends beyond World War II. Modern military aircraft still carry Chaff dispensers. The strips are now made from fiberglass coated with aluminum or metallic film, cut to match modern radar frequencies. But the principle remains identical to what Curran invented in 1942. Every time a military aircraft deploys countermeasures against radar-guided missiles, it's using a direct descendant of the aluminum strips dropped over Hamburg in July 1943. The strategic lesson that simple, cheap countermeasures can neutralize sophisticated, expensive weapons systems has influenced military planning for 80 years. It reminds us that technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory if opponents can find asymmetric responses. It demonstrates that creativity and industrial capacity can overcome technological disadvantages. The story of Chaff also illustrates a broader truth about the Allied victory in World War II. American industrial capacity wasn't just about producing more tanks, ships, and aircraft than the enemy. Though that was important, it was about the ability to produce millions of ridiculous things that individually seemed trivial, but collectively became decisive. Billions of strips of aluminum foil, millions of carashes, countless miles of wire, pipe, and cable, infinite quantities of nuts, bolts, screws, and fasteners. Germany produced sophisticated weapons in limited quantities. America produced adequate weapons in limitless quantities, plus all the supporting materials that made those weapons effective. The Allies didn't just outfight the Axis, they outproduced them so thoroughly that by 1944, German forces were drowning in an ocean of Allied material. The Phantom fleet that appeared on German radar screens on June 6, 1944, was made of aluminum foil, but it represented something much more substantial: the industrial power of a nation that could produce 40 billion pieces of precisely cut metal just for one. Operation Dot, a nation with factories so efficient they could add this to their production schedules without disrupting anything else. A nation with the scientific creativity to invent the solution and the manufacturing capacity to deploy it at scale. When German radar operators watched their screens fill with contacts that night, they were seeing an illusion. But the industrial capacity that created that illusion was utterly real, and that capacity, more than any weapon or tactic, determined the war's outcome. The last chaff drops of the war happened in August 1945. By then, the Allies were dropping it more from habit than necessity. German radar networks had been destroyed or captured. The war in Europe had ended. Japan was days from surrender. But the aircraft kept dropping their bundles of aluminum foil, creating phantom fleets and phantom bomber formations that confused radar systems that no longer mattered. Those final chaff drops, unnecessary and pointless, somehow captured the abundance that characterized American war production. We made so much of everything that we kept using it, even when we didn't need to anymore. That abundance, that almost wasteful excess of productive capacity, was the ultimate advantage. It meant we never had to carefully husband resources or make agonizing choices between competing priorities. We just made more of everything. The aluminum foil that fooled Hitler was cut in factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan by workers who never saw combat, never fired shots, never faced enemy soldiers. Their contribution was cutting metal to precise specifications, bundling it carefully and packing it for shipment. It seemed mundane. It was actually decisive. That's the real story of American industrial power in World War II. Not the dramatic moments of battle, but the countless mundane moments of production that made victory inevitable. Cutting aluminum foil, welding ship hulls, packing rations, each task trivial in isolation, collectively overwhelming in aggregate. The Phantom fleet that appeared off Calais on June 6, 1944. Was the physical manifestation of this principle. It didn't exist. But the capacity to create that illusion, to produce 40 billion strips of metal, cut to micrometer precision, to train crews to drop it in exact patterns, to coordinate it all with an invasion, involving 156,000 troops and 6,000 ships, that capacity was devastatingly real. Hitler kept his best divisions waiting for ships made of aluminum foil. By the time he realized his mistake, the real invasion had succeeded. The deception cost $30,000 in materials. The industrial capacity behind it was priceless, and 156,000 Allied soldiers landed on beaches that might have been impregnable if those phantom ships hadn't kept Hitler's attention focused 150 miles in the wrong direction. Sometimes, the greatest weapons are the simplest ones, when backed by the industrial capacity to deploy them at scale. Joan Curran's aluminum foil proved that in the most definitive way possible. It blinded the most sophisticated air defense network in the world, created phantom invasions that fooled the German High Command, and helped change the course of human history. All with precisely cut strips of aluminum foil, dropped from aircraft by crews, who probably wondered if their missions made any difference at all. They did. Those bundles of metallic confetti may have saved D-Day, and all it took was aluminum foil, American factories, and the insight to ask, what if the simplest solution is actually the best one?